The amendment process, as outlined by Article 5, is one of a number of parts of the U.S. Constitution where responsibilities are given directly by the Constitution to state legislatures. Another example that became familiar recently was the state legislative power to determine how presidential electors are chosen. The amendment power, like the power to choose presidential electors, comes directly from the Constitution. When you as state legislators exercise it, you do not operate under your own state constitutions. You operate under the U.S. Constitution. Now, we've heard some of the problems. One that we did hear about was the potential for fiscal ruin. I want to add another one to this list, wasteful and destructive spending, and let me tell you why I'm adding it. I'm a former academic. I'm a refugee from academia, and I can tell you that a great deal of the nonsense that comes out of academia is funded by the federal government. And if the federal government had to do things that were real, like national defense and pay for Social Security, then it would have less money to sow social mischief by its grant programs. So I see the fiscal responsibility cause as not just one for fiscal responsibility, but it's also for preventing social damage. We have tried all kinds of solutions in dealing with the debt problem. You all know about them. The final constitutional alternative is the amendment process. I think we can stipulate that after 60 years of trying other solutions that they have not worked. The amendment process is our most powerful constitutional tool, and I want to make a point here. Amendments work. They really work. You may have heard people tell you, oh, an amendment isn't going to make any difference anyway because they don't follow the Constitution anyway. That line violates every lesson of history. Women would not be voting in many states without a constitutional amendment. It was a constitutional amendment that abolished slavery in those states that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't reach. It was constitutional amendments that gave us the Bill of Rights. It was a constitutional amendment that imposed term limits on the president that have been honored ever since. So historically, you simply cannot say that constitutional amendments don't work. They do. Why is that? I don't have the complete answer, but I can tell you that one reason is that a constitutional amendment is a powerful expression of political desires by the American people. If you get a constitutional amendment proposed and then adopted by 3/4 of the states, boy, does that send a message home. And let me just give you one example. In 1793, only 4 years after the US government got started, the US Supreme Court, in a burst of judicial activism, expanded its own jurisdiction under the Constitution. Now, did the founding generation stand by and say, well, let's elect good people so we can put better people on the court? No. The founding generation responded by immediately passing a constitutional amendment, reversing the Supreme Court opinion. That was the 11th Amendment, and it has full force today, over 200 years later. Constitutional amendments work. If someone tells you that constitutional amendments make no difference, all that person is doing is revealing his or her historical ignorance. Next, a common story is we don't know anything about the constitutional amendment process, that a convention under the Constitution has never been held, that the courts don't take Article 5 cases, that we just have no clue as to how the state operated Article 5 procedure works. You know, I used to believe something like that. And then when I was at the University of Montana as a law professor, I undertook a study of the amendment process. And what I learned was I was really wrong. And a lot of other people are wrong, because there is an enormous amount of information about Article 5, including nearly 50 reported Supreme Court decisions. And what they tell you is that this law is federal law. It doesn't depend upon state constitutions or statutes. It is federal law, and it is a unit. The same principles that apply in the ratification process apply in the proposal process and at every step along the way. And the result of that, ladies and gentlemen, is that I can tell you how the convention process and how the Article 5 process works to a near 100% certainty. We've already done much of it, most of it, nearly all of it. In fact, in a sense, we've done all of it. There is very little uncertainty in what I'm going to tell you. There is uncertainty in one area, the area of aggregation, which I'll address later, but that doesn't concern us at this point. Okay, let's start at the end. We've got a problem. We want to deal with it. So we need a constitutional amendment. So how do we get it? Well, Article 5 of the US Constitution tells us how to do it. Article 5 does not permit any convention or any other body to replace the US Constitution. There is no provision in the US Constitution for another constitutional convention. Let me say that again. There is no provision in the US Constitution for another constitutional convention. So if somebody tells you that an Article 5 convention is going to be a constitutional convention, it's going to rewrite the Constitution, that person is blowing smoke. In Colorado, we would know what he's smoking. Okay. The Article 5 is limited to amendments to this Constitution. If someone tells you that, well, a convention or Congress or whatever can alter the amendment process by itself, I've heard that, you know. We need 38 states to ratify a constitutional amendment. Oh, they'll just change the ratification process. That person is also blowing smoke, because the question of whether any operator within the amendment process can change the mode of ratification or change other parts of the process has been before the courts again and again and again and again. And the answer is always no, you can't do that. There is a uniform stretch of precedent extending over the past century, which says that no actor, no convention, no legislature, no Congress in the amendment process can change the ratification mechanism or any other part of the amendment process. Okay, we need three quarters of the states to ratify. It can be done by either legislature or by conventions. The choice of who of ratification method is made by Congress. This is called proposing the mode of ratification. And for the most part in our history, Congress has sent constitutional amendments, proposed constitutional amendments to the states for ratification or rejection. However, when the 21st Amendment was before the people, Congress decided to send this amendment to state conventions. And that meant that individuals in the states could vote for convention delegates who were pledged either to vote for or against the 21st Amendment, that is to say, the repeal of prohibition. And so this actually gave the people of the United States, acting through their individual states, a way of voting on an amendment. And that's one reason why Dave Biddulph and other people recommend that a balanced budget amendment be ultimately sent to ratification conventions rather than to the legislatures. Whatever method is used, note that there's some commonalities between legislatures and conventions. They're both popularly elected. Like every other body operating under the amendment process, they operate under federal law, under the US Constitution. and they follow certain standard rules that have become the norms in the Anglo-American legal system. You may have heard this. If we had a convention for proposing amendments, what would be the rule of decision? Would it require 2/3 of delegates? Would it require 3/4 of delegates? People who ask questions like that have never heard of something called the parliamentary common law. The parliamentary common law tells us how decisions are made in parliamentary bodies. And for those of you who are legislators in states that use Mason's manual, you will find many references to the parliamentary common law. And one of those is that in absence of a rule to the contrary, decisions are made by a majority of those present and voting, a quorum being present. However, it is also true under the parliamentary common law that a convention, a legislature, or any similar body can adopt its own rules. So Congress chooses a mode of ratification. We're backing up in time here. When can Congress choose a mode of ratification? Well, when it's got a proposed amendment. Congress simply can't decide, well, one day we'll choose a mode of ratification for what? Well, for nothing. There has to be a proposed amendment for Congress to choose such a mode. And there are two ways of proposing amendments. One that you're probably familiar with is Congress or a convention for proposing amendments. If the amendment is proposed by Congress, it takes 2/3 of each house. However, 2/3 of a quorum, not 2/3 of all present, because the default rule continues to apply. If, on the other hand, the method of proposing is by convention, then the convention is triggered by a congressional call, by the congressional call. Now, let me say something about the congressional call, because this is another topic that is the subject of a lot of misinformation. The misinformation I hear on this issue is, when Congress determines the call, they can control the convention. The same people who say the convention is uncontrollable also tell us that Congress can control it. I don't have time to get into their arguments. Let's just say the arguments don't have any legal reality. When Congress calls a convention, it acts as an agent of the states. And terms in Article 5, the courts tell us, terms in Article 5 have the meanings they had at the time of the founding. And what a call means is you're invited to a convention at such and such a time, at such and such a place to discuss this subject, period. That's it. Congress can go no further. We have a convention, a kind of convention that meets nationally about every 4 years, right? It's called the Electoral College. The Electoral College is, in fact, a kind of convention. It's a single purpose convention limited for the purpose of electing the president and the vice president of the United States, nothing else. So if someone suggests to you the convention might run away, you might ask if we should cancel the next presidential election because the Electoral College might run away. Okay, so when does Congress call? When does Congress call? Congress calls when it receives resolutions from 2/3 of the states, now 34, demanding that it do so. Sometimes you'll hear the word petition used to describe an application. People will say, well, Congress has to call a convention when it gets petitioned by 2/3 of the legislatures. Folks, it's not a petition. An amendment passed for a convention is not a petition. It is a conditional demand. It is a demand that Congress call a convention. And if there are 34 applications on a particular subject, then Congress has no choice. Everybody who's looked at it agrees on that point. One difference, a huge difference between the convention for proposing amendments and the ratifying conventions, which we've already seen, is the ratifying conventions are meetings of representatives of the people directly. But a convention for proposing amendments is a convention of the states. That is to say, it is a gathering of sovereignties together. It's actually modeled on international law. You know, you've probably heard of the Congress of Vienna. It's the same sort of thing, in which sovereignties get together to negotiate solutions to common problems. And in such a gathering, each sovereignty is equal. Another good example is NATO. NATO is run by something called the North Atlantic Council. The sovereignties are equal in NATO. The smallest government gets the same vote as anybody else. And that is the nature of an amendments convention. One of the things I've heard an awful lot is the only convention we've ever had was the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and so we don't have any precedents. And I am embarrassed to admit that I sort of believe that at one time as well. In fact, we've had about 40 different conventions of states and parliament and colonies. The reasons why the founders chose the Convention of States mechanism for proposing amendments is it was really familiar. There had been about 20 conventions of colonies during the colonial era. And then after independence and the time the Constitutional Convention met, there were 10 different conventions of states. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, one of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, this was his 6th convention that he'd been to. They knew this system very, very well. And we have continued to meet in conventions since that time. Not as often, but we have nevertheless continued to meet in convention. And the most recent was the Phoenix Convention of 2017, of which the great Ken Ivory served as vice president. All conventions of states have been limited. All conventions of states have been limited. In the case of a convention for proposing amendments, they are limited to proposing only amendments, and they're limited to the scope of the call. And they are also subject to state legislative instruction. Now, what are the chances of a convention under those circumstances running away? Let's suppose we've got a convention for the purposes of proposing a balanced budget amendment, and some clown stands up and says, "No, I think we should propose campaign finance reform," right? Well, first off, and we saw this at the simulated convention, immediately there's going to be a call to order. You're out of order, that's outside the agenda. And secondly, since the people back home are going to be watching, right, on their computers, the whole thing is going to be streamed. This guy's going to get a text message, which is going to say something like, "Sit down and shut up or come home." So the chances of a runaway under current conditions, and again, a runaway's never happened, including at the Constitutional Convention, that's a myth. The runaway has never happened at any of these conventions, but the chances of it happening now is somewhere between 0 and -1, because anyone who gets out of line can instantly be reined in by a call from home. So where did the story come that conventions are unlimited? Well, those people who are very, very conservative and belong to certain very conservative groups who spread the story that conventions are unlimited might be embarrassed to know that the myth actually was first disseminated widely in the American public by very liberal interests. It was in the 1960s and 1970s. Here's what happened. The Warren Court was out of control. The Supreme Court at that time was out of control. It adopted a number of decisions, including Roe versus Wade, the abortion decisions, that most states wanted to overturn. And so a movement developed for the calling of a convention for proposing amendments. In addition, the debt began to veer out of control, at least by those standards. And so a lot of people wanted a balanced budget amendment. Well, these were all popular amendments. So what is the liberal establishment to do? They can't attack those amendments head on. So they said, well, you don't want to call a convention because I'll run away, rewrite the Constitution. And believe me, this is something that Theodore Sorensen actually said they might move the capital to Topeka. Strikes me as a reason for holding a convention, but at any rate, that's where it came from. It was propaganda introduced by liberal establishment figures in the 60s and 70s, and it had no historical basis to it. An Article 5 convention is called by Congress, but then it is formed by the state legislatures. Those of you who are state legislators, you are the guys who choose who the commissioners are or who's going to designate the commissioners. You're going to be the ones that determine how a state is going to cast its vote. You're the ones going to be giving the instruction to the commissioners. And if somebody gets out of line, you're the one sending that text message which says, come home. In sum, this procedure is well known, well understood to anyone who has seriously studied the history and the law behind it. 34 legislators can begin it at any time, and I urge you, please do so.